Ah yes, Uldaman, a blast from the past. Now this dungeon is in general one of the easier ones on the front, but don't get fooled cause I've personally seen some hell going on over there. But in today's guide, complete updated guide, you will be able to avoid all of the pitfalls of the Uldaman Mythic Plus dungeon, because we're covering everything you need to know. Routes, abilities, things you have to dodge, different strategies and tips and tricks so you can have your Uldaman runs smoother. These guides, alongside with the class guides, are 100% supported by our Patreons, patreon.com/Marcelian&Online. Thank you guys for making all of these possible, and if you enjoy these guides and the class guides, maybe check the link in the description. There's cool rewards over there for you. Depending on the tier, you can get a custom wallpaper with your character on it, access to bloopers, Patreon exclusive podcast, and much more. But the most important thing in the world is supporting the Marcelian Online content, alright? Now let's check the route. There aren't too many route options in the dungeon, but depending on what you might want to skip and your key level, you can pick and choose between a couple of trash packs. In hierarchies, especially in Tyrannical, you can also start off with the second boss on the list, Bromach, in order to get Bloodlust on cooldown, as you probably won't need it much for the dwarves. There's also an out-of-combat movement speed buff available for this dungeon if you have a Dragonflight Miner with you with at least 25 skill. There are 3 crumbling rock veins within the dungeon which you can mine, and then click the tome hidden under them or a stackable 10% auto-combat movement speed buff, and you can see their location on the Keystone Guru map. Now let's start off with the trash leading up to the first 2 boss fights. Scavenging Leapers do melee attacks and ambush, leaping to a random target and damaging all enemies within 4 yards of their target, so you may not want to stack too closely for these. Hulking Berserkers do a brutal slam attack, an AoE swirly around the mob, which you should move out of unless you want to get stunned. They also cast Diseased Bite, which does small amounts of instant physical damage and applies a disease on the target which slows them by 30%. Their Reckless Rage places an enrage effect on all nearby enemies, including the bosses, which increases their damage done by 20%, but also their damage taken by 20%. This is only cast below 40% health, and the effect is removable with suits if the damage on the tank or party gets too high. Stonevolt Geomancers are interruptible mobs who cast Stone Spike, dealing nature damage, but more importantly, they cast Chain Lightning, which you should always interrupt as it chains nature damage to up to 3 targets, and it can get rough in big fortified packs. Vicious Basilisks have an interruptible Spiked Carapace cast, buffing them with the magic Purgeable effect if the cast goes through. The buff inflicts nature damage to their attackers for both ranged and melee spells. Their Chomp puts a physical dot on their target for 9 seconds, which stacks, so keep them CC'd and kill them quickly. Burly Rock Throwers are trash mobs on the way to Bromach, and they do throw rock, which, well, throws a rock at their target's location, dealing physical damage to players within 3 yards of the impact. Rocks are avoidable, and the mobs do no other damage, so just stack them up with the rest of the packs and cleave them down. The first boss is composed of 3 poor little dwarven brothers who lost their way in the quest for ancient knowledge, untold riches, and worldwide fame. They've been underground for so long they no longer distinguish friends from foes, and you have to knock some sense into them and get them to help you out in the dungeon by at least opening some doors for you, like proper gentlemen. Balog casts Heavy Arrow, aiming and firing an arrow in a straight line, inflicting physical damage to players struck and knocking them back. His Wild Cleave attack also inflicts physical damage, but this time to players within 10 yards in front of him, so tanks, make sure to face him away from the group. Eric, the Swift, charges towards a target's destination, dealing physical damage to players within 5 yards and disorienting them for 3 seconds with Skullcracker, so move out of the swirla. He also does a dagger throw, throwing a dagger at a random player, inflicting 100% of his normal attack damage, so healers, make sure to top off your group quickly. Olaf casts a defensive bulwark, an interruptible cast which puts a shield around himself, protecting him and any other enemy within the area, taking 75% reduced damage for 12 seconds or until the cast is interrupted. His second attack is Ricocheting Shield, where he throws his shield at a player, inflicting physical damage. This also ricochets to up to 5 players within 5 yards, so stay spread if you get targeted by this. Another way to deal with this mechanic is to be close to one of the pillars and quickly hide behind it, line of sighting the boss and making him cancel his attack. When the dwarves reach 100 energy, all 3 dwarves will do a longboat raid, gaining new abilities while they are on their fancy boat. Searing Cannon Fire are nasty swirlies you need to dodge whenever any of the dwarves is in the boat. The cannon fire will be shot at an increased rate depending on how many dwarves are inside the boat at the time, due to hasty rearming. If you happen to get hit by the cannon fire, you will get knocked back, suffer some fire damage, and gain a 12-second stackable Searing Cannon Fire dot, dealing fire damage to you. Luckily, this is a magic effect, and your healer will be able to dispel it off of you if you find it too difficult to dodge the very obvious, fiery hell raining from the floaty boat. Damn. The locations where the dwarves shoot also get covered with burning pitch, dropping lava on the floor which deals fire damage when standing inside of it. If you want to be a pro gamer, you can also bait these away from the main area of the fight while being careful to not block yourself or your friends in a bad corner. This is easier to do for ranged players who can bait the swirlies up this hill in the back, or even at the stairs on the left, over here. This way, the melee players will have an easier time on the boss, not having to get cornered for lack of space. Don't outrange or LOS your healer, however, because every time the longboat fires, Fiery Surge will hit all players with a blast of flames dealing moderate fire damage. When the longbow raid is over, Phase 1 restarts with the same mechanics we had at the beginning of the fight. However, when a dwarf reaches 10% health, he will go back into the longboat and start shooting Searing Cannon Fire again, resulting in more lava on the floor and more group damage by Fiery Surge. Therefore, it is best to cleave down all the bosses equally so you don't run out of room towards the end of the fight, if 2 bosses are back into the boat shooting at you while the last boss is still at half health. When all the bosses reach 10% health, the fight is over and the dwarves give up. From here on out, they will join us and help us out by opening doors throughout the rest of the dungeon. In Bromach's room, there's also a trash bag formed by 2 berserkers and a geomancer, which we already discussed, but we mentioned them again here because there are some groups who prefer pulling these together with the boss due to the berserker's enrage effect from Reckless Rage when they reach 40% health, buffing this effect on the boss, making him deal and take 20% extra damage. We prefer to pull them separately for safety reasons, but if you want to try this, let us know how it worked out for you. As for Bromach, he is the shaman chieftain of the Stonevolt Trogs. He casts Call of the Deep, summoning more Trogs to help him out in the fight. There will always be 1 Stonevolt Geomancer and 3 Stonevolt Ambushers per wave, which have the same spells as the trash mobs. Basically, interrupt the Geomancer, especially when he does Chain Lightning, and cleave them down all with the boss. The boss also summons a Quaking Totem, which pulses Shocking Quake, dealing nature damage to the group every 2 seconds while it is up. When the totem is killed, it causes a tremor, which stuns all Trogs within 8 yards of the totem for 10 seconds and increases their damage taken by 200%. This stun can and should be used to interrupt the other 2 abilities the boss does, Bloodlust and Thundering Slam. If the boss finishes casting Bloodlust, he will empower himself and all other active Trogs, increasing their haste by 30% for 2 seconds. The boss also occasionally casts Thundering Slam, slamming the ground, dealing large amounts of nature damage to all players within 12 yards. After you kill the boss and defeat the lost dwarves as well, the dwarves will come help out to open up the door to carry on in the dungeon. After Bromach's death, a neglected mole machine will also spawn in his room, becoming the first checkpoint of the dungeon, and you can use this to teleport to and from the entrance. This checkpoint is named Alpha on the mole machine, and the second checkpoint, which will become available later on in the dungeon, will be marked under the name Beta. Moving forward, we encounter loads more trash mobs with plenty of new abilities to learn. Earthen Custodians only cast Cleave every now and then, hitting their main target and players within 3 yards of them, so don't be in front and don't stack on the tank. Refty Custodians can hurt quite a lot if not handled right. They have an Ancient Power buff, which increases their damage and haste by 10%, stacking up the longer they are in combat with you. In order to reset their stacks, you'll have to make use of their Antique Constitution aura, which increases their vulnerability to most stun effects. Whenever they get stunned, they will gain the Systematic Vulnerability debuff, which causes them to take increased damage by 50% and be stunned for the next 6 seconds. The only ability these mobs actually do is Jagged Bite, a hard-hitting dot on the tank, especially when the Custodian has high stacks. However, it is also possible to avoid the dot. The Custodian does not move while casting it, so you can move out of melee range before the cast finishes, and then you'll not get the dot. The mob will however recast Jagged Bite as soon as he gets into melee range again, so you would have to keep moving out of melee range every time he starts the cast again. This can be tricky to achieve for every cast, but it is a nice way to avoid some damage taken on the tank. When you get to the last Refty Custodian, just before the next boss, the dwarves will help you out again with opening the door, this time with some physical headwork from Olaf. In this area, be careful with pet classes, as they often bug out and are not able to walk up the stairs if you are kiting the Custodian through there, so don't pull the mobs near the entrance and keep an eye on your pets before you start the fight. You may have to resummon them. The last mobs in this area are the Earthen Weavers, who cast Stone Bolts, dealing nature damage to a random target, so keep them interrupted. They also channel Hail of Stone, an AoE of stone bolts dealing nature damage to all players within 40 yards every second for 6 seconds. This can be stopped by the use of crowd control abilities. On our route, however, we suggest skipping these mobs as the packs on both sides of the room are connected and we do not need them to get to 100%. But it's good to know what they do, as you will encounter them again right after the next boss. Sentinel Talondras is one of them refty snake people, and she is very determined to keep the unworthy away from progressing in their search for Tyr's discs. This is a pretty tough fight in Tyrannical Weeks, or high keys in general, if you go in without some defensive abilities on hand. The boss will occasionally place resonating orbs on players, visible through the light circle it creates around them, which will turn into a swirly after a few seconds, which will then become a bright orb of light. 2 of these will be placed on their players, and the third one will spawn at random around the room. Move out of the swirlies once they spawn, as they will stun you for 6 seconds. Be careful where you position these depending on how your group wants to approach this boss. We generally place them in the central area of the room so the tank can make use of them when he needs them to affect the boss, as carefully kiting the boss in them will either stun her or remove some of her stacks, which we will discuss momentarily. Throughout the fight, the boss slowly generates energy due to her ancient dynamo. Stunning her resets the energy she gained, but 3 seconds later she will slowly start gaining energy again and will cast an Erexible on herself. This will harden the boss, making her immune to the next 2 stun effects. This buff can be removed by using the resonating orbs we discussed, or by using player or pet stun abilities. If the boss is not stunned and manages to reach 100 energy, she will cast Titanic Empowerment, making her immune to all CC abilities and increasing her damage done by 50% for 30 seconds, so make sure you stun her before the end of his cast. The use of player stuns or pet stuns can also be used to stop her from casting her Crushing Stomp ability, which is a fairly hard-hitting attack dealing group-wide physical damage and knocks everyone backwards, so be careful not to stand in front of a resonating orb at this point, otherwise you might get knocked into it and get stunned. The stomp can be deadly on higher tyrannical keys if a player is already low from the hard-hitting Earthen Shards bleed that the boss regularly throws on players. This deals a large amount of physical damage when applied and puts a bleed on the target, which ticks every 2 seconds for 10 seconds. While it is great to interrupt the boss's abilities with the use of stuns, you do not want to do it too often, as every time she gets stunned or casts Titanic Empowerment, she gains a stack of Unrelenting, increasing her damage done by 5% for the rest of the fight. What we generally do regarding stuns is using 2 orbs to drop her interactable buffs and then use a player stand to stop the Titanic Empowerment cast. Moving on towards the next boss, we have more angry dwarves to deal with. Earthen Warders cast Earthen Ward, which becomes a purgeable, damage-absorbed shield on an enemy, so keep them interrupted, or if you have a squishy mage in your group, let him spell steal them. These mobs also cast Curse of Stone, placing a curse on a random target, slowing their movement speed. When this curse runs out, the player will be trapped in stone for 4 seconds and will get a swirly around them. When the curse expires, a large amount of damage will be dealt within the area. Luckily, due to the fact that the initial Curse of Stone reduces movement speed, it can also be removed by movement-impairing removal abilities such as Disengage, Freedom, Tiger's Lust, Shapeshifts, etc. So keep an eye out for it and get rid of it before it becomes problematic. The Runic Protector is a dangerous mob and a priority to kill, especially on fortified weeks. He does an unavoidable AoE ability, Earthquake, inflicting physical damage to everyone within 60 yards. His second ability is Fissuring Slam, hitting hard on the tank and creating a patch of difficult terrain under all the players, causing them to be slowed by 40% and take 40% more damage while standing in it. So move out of this as soon as possible. This ability in combination with the Earthquake or the Hail of Stone from the Weavers can be quite deadly, so beware. 2 other mobs you encounter just before the 4th boss are the Skittering Crawlers and the Cavern Seekers. The Skittering Crawlers have a chance to apply a Venomous Fangs stack on melee hits, ticking every 1.5 seconds. They also cast Pounce, leaping to a random player and dealing moderate physical damage. The Cavern Seeker casts Sonic Burst, an interruptible cast which silences everyone within 45 yards for 3 seconds, so keep it interrupted when available. The next boss is Emberon, who uses the statues around the room to help him out in the fight. He starts off by activating 4 dormant Vault Keepers around the room, placing a fire shield around them while they start casting Seeking Flame. This is a ball of fire launched at random players traveling in a straight line to where the player was when the keeper finished the cast, so you should sidestep these and make sure you dodge all the balls that were aimed at the other players as well, as they hurt a lot. Throughout the fight, the boss applies unstable embers on the group members. This is a circle around each player which will do damage after 3 seconds to the affected target and any other player within 7 yards, so stay spread out. The boss will also cast Searing Clap, an unavoidable frontal attack aimed at the tank, so tanks turn the boss away and make sure nobody else gets hit by this as it deals a large amount of fire damage. Each time the boss does Searing Clap, he also applies Burning Heat to all players, a dispellable magic dot that deals fire damage every 2 seconds for 10 seconds. When the boss reaches 100 energy, he moves to the middle of the room and casts Sacred Barrier, making himself immune to damage. His heat engine will deal large amounts of fire damage and knock players back if they try to enter the Sacred Barrier throughout this phase. While the barrier holds, the boss will start channeling Purging Flames, initially spawning a line of swirlies on the floor, which will then turn into a large beam of fire, splitting the room in 2. The beam of fire will continuously move clockwise around the room, so make sure you don't get hit by it while you go around attacking the 4 active Vault Keepers. While channeling Purging Flames, the boss also does a fire wave every 3 seconds, dealing a small amount of fire damage to all players. If possible, try to have the whole group on the same side of the beam so you don't get cut off from your healer. After the 4 active Vault Keepers are deactivated, you go back to the first phase again. The boss will again activate 4 dormant Vault Keepers and the fight continues this way until Emberon is dead. Something to mention about this fight, however. At the moment, the beam of fire in phase 2 is occasionally misplaced. aka the swirlies show in one location, but when the beam activates, it will be elsewhere, and you may be in its way as it spawns without knowing why you died. What we recommend in this situation is to keep an eye out on the boss as well as the swirlies and check where his right hand is facing, as that's where the beam is going to emanate from. Hopefully this will save the keys of some brave adventurers. The first new mob you encounter after Emberon is the Ebonstone Golem. This mob has only one ability, Thunderous Clap, and what an ability it is! The clap deals large amounts of nature damage to anyone getting hit by it, and it's a pain to deal with in high fortified keys or bolstering weeks. The good thing about it is that you can line of sight it. Just make sure you are hiding around the corner of a pillar before he finishes his cast and you won't take any damage from it. Your healer will love you. Next, we have the Earthen Guardian, generally in packs with other types of mobs. The Guardian casts Bulwark Slam on the tank, dealing a lot of physical damage, but he also casts Blessing of Tyr. Once the cast is complete, he channels a shield around himself, dealing moderate holy damage to all players within it with Scorn of Tyr, and empowering all other mobs that are standing inside it with Blessing of Tyr, increasing their damage done by 20% while within the shield. You can easily deal with this by using the line of sight areas to pull the other mobs out of the shield if they hit too hard. In the last hallway leading up to the last boss, you'll encounter 3 new Dragonskin mobs, the first being the Infinite Agents. These mobs cast Time Blade on the tank, dealing moderate physical damage and slowing them by 50% for 9 seconds. They also cast Hasten, increasing their haste and movement speed by 30% for 12 seconds. The spell is interruptible, and if it goes through, the buff on the mob can be purged or spell stolen. The second Dragonskin mob is the Infinite Time Reaver. This one puts a nasty magic debuff on everyone in line of sight of the mob approximately every 4 seconds, so start appreciating mass dispels. This Stolen Time debuff deals arcane damage every second and reduces haste by 2% per stack. The debuff lasts 6 seconds, it is dispellable, and it is possible to LOS the new application if you time it right, allowing the debuff to time out before continuing to DPS again. For the tank, it is quite hard to LOS the debuff, so the easiest way we found to do it is if the healer dispels the tank every now and then, and if you don't have a mass dispel, then the rest of the group can LOS occasionally to drop their stacks. The last mob, although quite insignificant, is an Infinite Whelp. As these are just whelps, they have not learned any spells or abilities yet, so they only do some melee attacks on the tank. Pretty complicated. For our route, we advise to skip the last 2 Infinite Time Weavers as they take quite some time to kill and you can reach 100% mob count already before this. You can either use invisibilities such as a potion or shroud from a rogue, but you can also jump on the other side of the wall behind the pillar here and then just walk around the mobs. After you've passed these, you've reached the final boss of this dungeon. And the final boss is Chrono-Lord Deios, whom we may or may not encounter soon enough. No spoilers. Deios starts the fight with 100 temporal energy and uses this energy to create eternity orbs, which slowly fall from above and inflict arcane damage to all players when they land and then form an eternity zone. These zones slowly grow bigger and deal arcane damage to players who stand inside them, but also reduce their haste by 30%. Try to stay close to them, however, as the swirlies will spawn close to where players are, so in high tyrannical keys you may end up running out of room if the zones are covering the entire room. Throughout the fight, he will also put a time sync magic debuff on 3 players, which deals ticking arcane damage and reduces their movement speed by 35% for 9 seconds. When dispelled or when this debuff runs out, it will leave behind a time eruption, a big swirly that will deal a large amount of arcane damage and knock you back if you don't move out in time. Due to the fact that this debuff also has a movement reduction effect, it can be once again removed by movement impairing removal abilities such as Disengage, Freedom, Tiger's Lust, etc. When the boss runs out of energy, he will channel Rewind Time Flow. During this channel, the boss does arcane damage to players for the next 12 seconds, but most importantly, reverses the effects from the Eternity Orbs and the Eternity Zones. While time is being reversed, the Eternity Zones will become Temporal Zones, now shrinking, no longer dealing damage to players, and increasing their haste by 50% instead of decreasing it. So go stand in the zones during this channel to get a nice Bloodlust effect. They'll also shrink back into Temporal Orbs, which will slowly float upwards instead of down, as opposed to the Eternity Orbs. After Rewind Time Flow is over, the boss has energy again and continues casting the same abilities as before, so you should once again avoid the zones now. The boss also occasionally does Wing Buffet, where he will flap his wings, causing players to take a moderate amount of arcane damage and get knocked back. His last ability is Sand Breath, a frontal cone attack aimed at the tank which deals large amounts of arcane damage to all players caught in it. And this is pretty much it. You have successfully completed all of the necessary information and vital information to have a Uldaman Mythic Plus completed in time and get that sweet loot. Thank you, Patreons, for keep on supporting these guides plus the class guides. Remember to check patreon.com/Marcelian&Flame for more details on how you can support this content if you want to. Of course, not required if you want to, but it goes a long way. And thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments if this helped or not. Have a great one, y'all. Catch you in the next one.
I've been loving it then, I still love it now. Still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. Getting better every day, let me show you how. Cause still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. It's getting harder to stay, but at the end of the day, it's a guilty pleasure, so just log in and play. Whether it's classical retail, I'ma do a /bow. Still, I play WoW.